Some stories begin with thunderclaps. Others start so quietly you almost miss the sound, a scent in the air, a single chime of a bell, a note left where no one should have left it. One ordinary Sunday afternoon was all it took for everything in my life to shift, though at the time, I believed it was just another peaceful day. I need to tell you about the day everything started. The day I met her. It was a Sunday afternoon in September. The kind of day when the light comes through your windows just right. I remember standing in my kitchen, arranging chrysanthemums in my old glass vase. The stems smelled sharp and green under my fingers. I had lived in that house for 40 years. Every floorboard knew my footsteps. Michael called that morning after church. He said he was bringing someone special. My heart did that thing mothers' hearts do, joy mixed with worry. You know the feeling. I heard his car pull up around 2. I wiped my hands on my apron and went to the window. Michael got out first, then she stepped out of the passenger side. Tall, poised, wearing a cream dress that looked expensive. Her hair was swept up in one of those elegant styles I never could manage. Everything about her said polished. Then the back door opened. Another woman emerged, older, maybe early 60s like me, navy suit, pearls, catching the sunlight. She looked at my modest ranch house the way you'd inspect something at a yard sale. Calculating. That's the word that came to mind. I opened the door before they knocked. Michael's face glowed with happiness. He said, "Mom, this is Linda," and her mother, Doris. Linda shook my hand with practiced firmness. She told me Michael had said so much about me. She called my home charming. The word felt hollow somehow, like when someone compliments your cooking but leaves half their plate untouched. Doris swept past me without much of a greeting. Her eyes were already roaming my living room. She picked up Michael's graduation photo from the mantel. She said I must be so proud. Her voice was pleasant enough, but there was something underneath it, something I couldn't quite name yet. We sat down in the living room. I had prepared coffee and my apple pie, the recipe my mother taught me 60 years ago. Linda took a bite and told me it was delicious. She said she'd been trying to perfect her baking skills. I wondered if that was true or just something people say. Michael held Linda's hand. His touch was gentle, real. My son always wore his heart on his sleeve. That worried me sometimes. Then Doris set down her coffee cup. The sound was sharp against the saucer. She announced we should discuss wedding plans. Just like that, as if everything was already decided. I must have looked surprised because Linda laughed. But Doris kept talking. She mentioned a country club an hour north, a ballroom that seats 300 people. 300. I only had 50 guests at my own wedding. Michael shifted on the couch. He said they hadn't talked about budget yet. His voice was uncertain. Doris waved her hand like she was brushing away a fly. She said these things work themselves out. She said you can't put a price on memories. Then she pulled out her phone. She showed us pictures of centerpieces with real orchids, a 6-tier cake, an orchestra for the reception. I watched Linda's face. She didn't say anything, didn't suggest something simpler or more modest. She just sat there with that same pleasant smile, letting her mother build these enormous expectations. That's when the cold feeling started in my chest. I tried to change the subject. I asked when they met. Michael brightened. He said 3 months ago at a charity fundraiser. Linda was volunteering at the registration table. Linda said she loved giving back to the community. Doris nodded and said they'd made substantial contributions over the years. She used the word substantial. She said it was their responsibility when one has been blessed with resources. I've helped organize church donation drives for decades. I know most of our regular donors by name. I had never heard of the Hartwell family. That was Linda's maiden name. So I asked which organizations they usually support. Just casual conversation, nothing suspicious. Something flickered in Doris's eyes. Just for a second. She said they prefer anonymous donations, more dignified than seeking recognition. Her smile stayed perfect the whole time. The conversation drifted. Michael's work, Linda's marketing job, Doris's late husband who was apparently in real estate. But I found myself watching instead of listening. The way Doris controlled every topic, the way Linda deferred to her mother so smoothly, like they'd rehearsed it. That's when the church bell began to ring. 3 o'clock. That bell has marked time in our town for over 100 years. I've heard it thousands of times. At my wedding, when my children were baptized, at my husband's funeral. It's as familiar as my own breathing. But that day, it sounded different. A shiver ran through me. The kind you feel when someone walks over your grave. That's what my mother used to say. Linda said what a lovely sound, so authentic and traditional. Her words felt scripted somehow. I told her the bell has rung for over a century. Sometimes I think it knows more about us than we know about ourselves. I don't know why I said that. It just came out. Doris glanced at her expensive watch. She said they should be going. So much to do, so many plans to make. She stood up like a queen dismissing court. Linda followed. At the door, Michael hugged me tight. He said he knew I'd love Linda. His voice was so hopeful, so trusting. I held my son close. I told him she seemed very nice. Then I said 3 months isn't very long. I couldn't help myself. His voice changed, just slightly. He said, "Mom, I'm 42 years old. I know what I'm doing." There was a warning in those words, a boundary I wasn't supposed to cross. I stood at the window and watched his car disappear down Hickory Street. The maples were just starting to turn gold. Fall was coming. Change was coming. The church bell had gone quiet, but its echo seemed to hang in the air, like it was waiting for something. I went back to clear the coffee cups. That's when I saw it. Doris's napkin, folded with geometric precision beside her plate. Something made me pick it up. There were numbers written in the corner, small, neat handwriting, dollar amounts maybe, or calculations. They'd been crossed out, like she thought better of leaving evidence behind. I carried that napkin to the kitchen. My hands trembled as I smoothed it out on the counter. I couldn't say exactly why. Maybe it was just intuition. That wordless knowledge mothers carry in their bones, or maybe it was memory. Years ago, I ignored warning signs about my own husband, hidden debts that nearly destroyed us. I learned the hard way what happens when you don't trust your gut. The bell rang again in the distance, just once. A single solitary chime, not quite a warning, but certainly not a blessing either. I stood there in my kitchen, holding that napkin with its crossed-out numbers. The afternoon light was fading. The chrysanthemums cast long shadows across my counter. That's when I knew. Deep in my bones, I knew. Something was wrong with this picture. Something was coming for my son, and I was the only one who could see it. The question was whether Michael would listen. Whether he'd trust his mother's instincts over his own heart, whether 40 years of knowing him would count for anything against 3 months of infatuation. I folded that napkin and put it in my recipe box, right next to my mother's apple pie card. Maybe I was being foolish. Maybe I was just a meddling old woman who couldn't let go. But that bell kept echoing in my memory, and I've lived long enough to know. When something sounds wrong, it usually is. That was the beginning. The day the warning came. I just didn't know yet how right I was to be afraid. For 3 days after that Sunday, I tried to convince myself I was wrong. I told myself I was just being a protective mother, the kind who can't let go. Maybe Linda and Doris were exactly what they seemed. Maybe I was the problem. But that napkin sat in my recipe box. Those crossed-out numbers haunted me. I'd take it out sometimes when I was alone, study it under the kitchen light. The calculations looked deliberate, purposeful, like someone planning something. Thursday morning, I needed groceries. Our town market sits on Main Street right across from the post office. I've shopped there since before you were born. The wooden floors creak in the same places they always have. The smell of fresh bread hits you the moment you walk in. I was in the produce section, testing avocados for ripeness. That's when I heard Margaret's voice. She runs the register, has for 30 years. She was talking to Tom, who stocks the shelves. Their voices carried over the bins of apples and oranges. Margaret said something about the Hartwell family. My hands went still. I pretended to examine a cantaloupe. Listening. Tom said he remembered them from a few years back. They'd ordered an expensive catering setup for some charity event. Promised to pay after the fundraiser. The money never came. He said his cousin ran the catering company, nearly went under because of that unpaid bill. Margaret's voice dropped lower. She said Doris Hartwell had a reputation, always making promises, always having reasons why the check was delayed. She said people eventually learned to avoid doing business with her. The cantaloupe felt heavy in my hands, cold. I set it down carefully. My heart was beating too fast for a woman my age. I abandoned my shopping cart, walked straight to the church. It was only 2 blocks away. The October wind carried the smell of wood smoke and dying leaves. My cardigan wasn't warm enough, but I barely noticed. Father Murphy was in his office when I knocked. He's been our priest for 15 years, a kind man with gentle eyes. He looked up from his paperwork and smiled, said it was good to see me, asked if everything was all right. I told him I needed to look at the donation records, the old ones. He seemed surprised, but he's known me long enough. He trusts me. He took me down to the church basement where we keep the files. The basement smells like old paper and dust, the kind of smell that makes you sneeze. Metal filing cabinets line the walls, records going back decades. Father Murphy showed me where the donation ledgers were kept. Then he left me alone, said to take my time. I started with records from 5 years ago, running my finger down the columns of names and amounts. The pages were yellowed at the edges. Some of the ink had faded, but the numbers were clear enough. It took me an hour to find it. There it was, Hartwell Family Foundation, a pledge for $5,000 toward the new community center roof. The date was marked, the amount recorded. But in the column for payment received, someone had written in red ink, "Never fulfilled." My hands shook as I turned more pages. There were other entries, smaller amounts, 1,000 here, 2,000 there, always pledged, never paid, each one marked with that same red notation, never fulfilled, or promise broken, or no payment received. I made notes on a piece of scrap paper, dates, amounts. The pattern was clear. The Hartwells made public pledges, got recognition at events, then disappeared when it came time to actually pay. I found one more thing, a letter tucked between the pages. It was from the community center director to Doris Hartwell. Very polite, very professional. But the message was clear. They were requesting the promised donation. The letter was dated 6 years ago. There was no record of a response. I took photos with my phone. My hands were steadier now. Purpose does that. It steadies you. I put everything back exactly as I found it. Then I climbed those basement stairs feeling 20 years older. Outside, the church bell rang 4 o'clock. The same bell that had warned me on Sunday. Today it sounded different, like it was confirming something. Like it was saying, "See? I told you. I didn't go home." I walked to Carol's house instead. She lives 3 streets over in a blue cottage with white shutters. We've been friends since our kids were in grade school together. She was a lawyer before she retired, sharp as a tack. If anyone could help me think this through, it was Carol. She answered the door in her gardening gloves. Dirt smudged on her cheek. She took one look at my face and said to come in. She put the kettle on without asking. That's what old friends do. We sat at her kitchen table. The kettle whistled. She made tea the way I like it, strong with a little honey. I told her everything. The Sunday visit, the napkin, what I'd heard at the market, what I'd found in the church records. Carol listened without interrupting. That's her lawyer training. She knows when to be quiet. When I finished, she sat back in her chair. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said we needed more information. She asked if I'd checked social media. I admitted I barely knew how to use it. She smiled, said that's what friends are for. She pulled out her laptop right there at the kitchen table. It took her about 20 minutes. She found Linda's Facebook page, Doris's Instagram. Both accounts were full of photos, charity galas, fundraising dinners, always dressed elegantly, always standing with important-looking people. The captions talked about giving back, about community service, about making a difference. But Carol's eyes were sharp. She pointed to the details. In every photo, they were guests, never hosts, never board members, never actually doing the work, just appearing at events, looking wealthy, looking generous. She found something else, a local news article from 3 years ago. A small business owner had filed a complaint, services rendered but never paid for. The business owner's name was listed. The defendant was Doris Hartwell. The case was settled out of court, details sealed. Carol looked at me across her kitchen table. The afternoon light was fading. Her face was serious. She said I was right to be concerned. She said this pattern was classic. Make a good impression. Create an image of wealth and generosity. Then exploit people's trust. I felt sick. My son was walking straight into this. My kind, trusting son who always saw the best in people. Carol reached across the table, squeezed my hand. Her grip was firm. She said we'd figure this out together. But she warned me. She said Michael wouldn't want to hear this. She said people in love don't listen to reason. I knew she was right. I'd seen it before. Not just with Michael, with friends, with neighbors. Love makes you blind, or maybe it makes you choose blindness, because seeing the truth means losing the dream. The walk home felt longer than usual. The streetlights were coming on. Jack-o'-lanterns grinned from porches. Halloween was coming. I thought about masks, about how some people wear them all the time, not just on Halloween, how they perfect the smile, the charm, the performance. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the house settle, the furnace clicking on, the refrigerator humming, all the familiar sounds, but my mind was racing. I kept seeing Michael's face, his happiness, his hope. He'd been alone for so long. He deserved love, real love, not this carefully constructed trap. Around midnight, I got up, made myself chamomile tea, sat at the kitchen table with my phone. I looked at the photos I'd taken in the church basement. The evidence was clear, but evidence isn't the same as belief. Michael would need more than old ledgers and broken promises. He'd need to see it himself, with his own eyes, in real time. Not ancient history from dusty files, not gossip from shopkeepers, something undeniable, something that couldn't be explained away. The question was how? How do you show someone the truth when they don't want to see it? When seeing it means their heart breaks? I didn't have an answer yet, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let this happen. Not to my son, not on my watch. I'd made mistakes before, ignored warnings, paid the price. I wouldn't make that mistake again. The church bell rang once in the distance, marking the half hour, 12:30. I was wide awake in my quiet kitchen, planning, thinking, preparing, because now I knew. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. It wasn't just a mother's worried heart. This was real. This was documented. This was a pattern as clear as those numbers on Doris's napkin. And patterns don't lie. People do. But patterns tell the truth. I waited until Friday evening to call Michael. I rehearsed what I'd say at least a dozen times, standing in my kitchen, pacing the living room. Each time the words felt wrong, too harsh, too gentle, too mothering. Finally, I just dialed. He answered on the third ring. His voice was cheerful. He asked how I was doing, if I needed anything. Always my thoughtful boy. I said I needed to talk to him, about Linda, about things I'd discovered. My voice was shaking even though I'd practiced staying calm. The silence on the other end lasted too long. Then he said, "Mom, please don't start this." Those words hit me like cold water. I hadn't even told him what I'd found yet. He was already building his wall, already defending her. That's when I knew how hard this would be. I told him about the church records anyway, the broken pledges, the unpaid donations. I kept my voice steady, factual. I said I had photos, documentation. This wasn't gossip or feelings. This was evidence. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said those were Doris's problems, not Linda's. He said Linda was different from her mother. He said I was judging her unfairly. I felt my throat tighten. I asked him about the market gossip, the catering bill that never got paid, the pattern of deception. I said this wasn't just one incident. This was years of behavior. His voice changed then, got harder. He said he was 42 years old, that he didn't need his mother investigating his fiancée like she was a criminal. He said I was embarrassing him, that I was crossing a line. The word fiancé stopped me cold. I asked when he'd proposed. My voice came out smaller than I meant it to. He said last Tuesday at the Lakeside Cafe. He'd wanted to tell me in person, but I was ruining that now. He said Linda made him happy. He said that should be enough for me. I tried to explain. I said I only wanted to protect him, that I'd seen this kind of thing before, that people who deceive in small ways will deceive in big ways too. He cut me off, said he had to go. Linda was coming over for dinner. He'd talk to me later when I was being more reasonable. Then the line went dead. I stood there holding my phone. My hand was trembling. The kitchen felt too quiet, too empty. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall, each second loud as a hammer. That night, I barely touched my dinner. Leftover chicken that tasted like cardboard. I pushed it around my plate, finally gave up, put it in the fridge. I sat in my armchair by the window, the same chair where I used to rock Michael to sleep, where I'd sat with him during thunderstorms when he was scared, where we'd read books together, hundreds of books, thousands of pages. How do you protect someone who doesn't want protecting? That's what I kept asking myself. How do you save someone who thinks they don't need saving? The memories came then, unbidden, unwanted, but relentless. My late husband, Robert, Michael's father. For 30 years, I thought I knew him, thought we had no secrets. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable, or so I believed. Then one Tuesday afternoon, a man knocked on my door. He said he was from the bank. He had foreclosure papers. I thought there'd been some mistake. I laughed, told him our mortgage was paid off. The man's face was patient, pitying. He said my husband had taken out a second mortgage, 18 months earlier, hadn't made a single payment. The house I'd lived in for decades, the house where I'd raised my children, it wasn't really ours anymore. Robert came home that evening like any other day, kissed my cheek, asked what was for dinner. I showed him the papers, watched his face crumble, watched 30 years of trust evaporate in 30 seconds. He'd been gambling, started small, got in too deep, kept borrowing, kept losing, kept hiding it. He swore he'd meant to fix it, to win it back, to make everything right before I ever knew. But that's the thing about deception. It never stays small. It grows, spreads, until one day a stranger knocks on your door with foreclosure papers. We survived it, barely, sold the house, moved to this smaller place, started over. But something broke between us that never quite healed. Trust is like china. Once cracked, it's never the same. You can glue it back together, but you'll always see the seams. Robert died 5 years later. Heart attack, quick and sudden. At his funeral, people said such nice things. What a good man he was. How devoted to his family. I nodded and smiled and said nothing. Some truths are too complicated for funerals. Sitting in my chair that Friday night, I realized something. Michael didn't remember those years. He was away at college when it happened. We'd protected him from the worst of it, told him we were downsizing, that we wanted something simpler. He never knew about the gambling, the lies, the near disaster. Maybe that was our mistake, shielding him from hard truths, teaching him that people are always what they seem, that love means absolute trust, that doubt is the enemy. But I'd learned different. I'd learned that sometimes doubt is wisdom, that sometimes suspicion is just pattern recognition, your brain seeing what your heart doesn't want to believe. Saturday morning, Michael didn't call. I did my usual errands, the grocery store, the pharmacy. People smiled and waved. "Mrs. Patterson, how are you today?" I smiled back, said I was fine. It's what you do. You carry your worries quietly. Don't burden the checkout girl with your family problems. Carol called around noon, asked if I'd talk to Michael. I told her how it went. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she'd expected that. She said we needed to be patient, strategic. She'd done more research, found 2 more businesses with complaints against Doris. Both cases settled quietly. Money exchanged for silence. Carol said that was telling. Guilty people settle. Innocent people fight. She said we needed to let Michael discover the truth himself, that anything we told him now would just make him defensive, make him cling harder to Linda. It's called the backfire effect, when evidence against a belief just makes people believe more strongly. I asked what we were supposed to do then. Just watch him walk into disaster? Carol's voice was firm. She said we gather more evidence. We stay close. We wait for the right moment. She said that moment would come. People like Doris and Linda always overplay their hand. We just had to be ready when they did. Sunday came. Michael usually visited after church. This time he didn't call, didn't text. The silence felt deliberate, punishing. I sat through the morning watching the phone, willing it to ring. It didn't. I went to church alone, sat in my usual pew. Father Murphy's sermon was about forgiveness, about letting go of grudges, about trusting in divine timing. I wondered if God had a sense of irony. After the service, I walked home slowly. The October air was crisp. The trees were at peak color, reds and golds and oranges, beautiful and dying at the same time, nature's last show before winter. My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, was raking leaves in her yard. She waved, asked if I'd heard about Michael's engagement. News travels fast in small towns. I forced a smile, said yes, said I was very happy. Another lie, but a necessary one. That afternoon I made soup, my mother's recipe, chicken and vegetables and barley, the kind that simmers for hours. The smell filled my house, warm and comforting. I made enough for 4 people, habit, hope, foolishness. I called Michael around 5, got his voicemail, said I'd made soup, said I was sorry if I'd upset him, said I just wanted him to be happy. All true, but not the whole truth. He texted back an hour later, said he was busy, maybe next week. The words were polite. The message was clear. Back off. I sat at my kitchen table with a bowl of soup I didn't want. The house felt too big, too quiet. My children had grown up here. Their voices used to fill these rooms, laughter, arguments, music, life. Now it was just me and the ticking clock. I thought about calling Carol, decided against it. She'd done enough. This was my burden, my son, my fight. The church bell rang in the distance. 6 o'clock, Sunday evening. In a few hours, Michael would be with Linda, planning their future, their wedding, their life together, a life built on sand. But he couldn't see that yet, and maybe he never would. Maybe I'd lose him anyway. Not to Linda's deception, but to my own interference. Maybe the truth would cost me my son just as surely as the lie would. That thought sat heavy in my chest, cold and hard, because here's what nobody tells you about being a parent. Sometimes protecting your children means risking their love. Sometimes doing the right thing feels exactly like doing the wrong thing. I finished my soup, washed the bowl, put away the leftovers. Outside my window, the sky was darkening, stars beginning to appear, the same stars that had watched over this town for centuries, watching families form and break and heal. I turned off the kitchen light, but I didn't feel dark inside, didn't feel defeated, because I'd been here before, in the hard place, the lonely place, the place where you stand on truth even when everyone else thinks you're wrong. And I'd survived it. That house we lost, that marriage we repaired, those years of starting over. I'd survived all of it. I was still here, still standing. Michael thought I was being unreasonable, meddling, embarrassing. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was all those things. But I was also his mother, and that meant something. It meant I'd fight for him even when he fought against me. It meant I'd wait in this uncomfortable place as long as it took, because truth has a way of surfacing, always does. The question wasn't if, it was when, and whether I'd still be there when it finally broke through. 2 weeks passed. 2 weeks of silence from Michael, the longest we'd gone without speaking since he was 18. I filled my days with small tasks, organizing closets, weeding the garden, things that kept my hands busy, kept my mind from spinning. Then Carol called on a Tuesday morning. She'd been doing more digging, found a woman in the next county, a caterer who'd worked with Doris 3 years ago. The woman was willing to talk, willing to go on record. Carol said we should meet with her, document everything, build a case. I asked if she thought we'd need it. She said we would. She said eventually Michael would ask for proof. We needed to be ready. We drove to Marion County that Thursday, an hour through farmland and small towns. Carol drove. I watched the fields roll by, corn stubble and bare earth, everything harvested, everything stripped down to truth. The caterer's name was Susan. She met us at a small diner off the highway. She was younger than me, maybe 50. Tired eyes. She ordered coffee. Her hands shook slightly when she lifted the cup. She told us about the charity gala. Doris had promised it would be a huge event, said there'd be 200 guests, said money was no object. Susan prepared accordingly, rented equipment, hired extra staff, bought premium ingredients. The event happened, but only 60 people showed up, and when Susan presented the bill, Doris claimed there'd been a misunderstanding, said they'd agreed on a different price, a much lower price. Susan had the contract, had it in writing, but Doris hired a lawyer, dragged it out, made it expensive to fight. Susan eventually settled for half what she was owed. She said it nearly bankrupted her. She had to let go of 2 employees, people who'd worked for her for years. She said the worst part wasn't the money, it was the lies. The way Doris smiled through it all, like it was just business. I thank Susan for meeting us, for being brave enough to speak up. She said she wished she'd spoken up sooner, maybe saved someone else the trouble. I told her it wasn't too late, that her story might still save someone. On the drive home, Carol and I were both quiet. The weight of what we knew sat heavy between us. This wasn't just about church donations anymore. This was about a pattern of destruction, of taking advantage, of ruining people's livelihoods. The call came the next day, Friday afternoon, Michael's voice on my phone. He said he needed to talk. Could he come over? There was something different in his tone, something uncertain. I said, of course, anytime. My heart was racing, but I kept my voice calm, steady. He arrived an hour later. He looked tired, lines around his eyes I hadn't noticed before. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd fed him countless meals, where he'd done homework, where we'd had so many conversations over so many years. He said there'd been a wedding planning meeting yesterday at the country club Doris had chosen. Linda and Doris were there, the event coordinator, the florist, the caterer. He said things got tense. The coordinator mentioned payment schedules, deposits. Linda got quiet. Doris started talking fast, making excuses, saying there'd been delays with their accounts, banking issues, nothing to worry about. Then the florist spoke up, said she needed the deposit before she could order the flowers. Doris's face changed. Michael said it was like watching a mask slip, just for a second. She snapped at the florist, said they'd managed events twice this size, said the deposit would come when it came. The coordinator intervened, said the venue required 50% up front. No exceptions. Doris stood up, gathered her purse, said they'd take their business elsewhere then. that plenty of venues would be grateful for their patronage. Linda followed her mother out, but as they left, Michael heard the coordinator mutter something about reputation, about checks that bounce, about people who make promises. Michael sat there in my kitchen, his hands flat on the table. He said he'd been thinking all night about what I'd said, about the church records, about patterns. I didn't say anything, just waited. Sometimes silence is the best response. He asked if I still had the documentation, the photos from the church basement, the information I'd gathered. I said I did. I asked if he wanted to see it. He nodded. So I got my folder, laid it all out on the kitchen table, the church ledger photos, the notes from Carol's research, the settlement records, Susan's contact information. Michael studied each piece, his engineer's mind working, analyzing, connecting dots. I watched his face change, watched hope turn to doubt, doubt turn to understanding, understanding turn to something harder. He was quiet for a long time. Then he asked why Linda hadn't told him, about her mother's history, about the pattern. I said maybe she didn't know, or maybe she did, but either way, the deception was real. He said he needed to talk to Linda, needed to hear her side. I told him that was fair, that was right. But I also said to pay attention, to watch what she did, not just what she said. He left around dinner time, hugged me at the door, longer than usual, tighter, like he was holding on to something, or maybe letting go of something. It was hard to tell. That weekend, I barely slept, kept my phone close, waited for news. Saturday passed, then Sunday. Nothing. The silence felt different this time, not angry, just heavy, like the pause before a storm breaks. Monday afternoon, Michael called. He said he'd talked to Linda. It hadn't gone well. She'd cried. Said her mother had problems, but she wasn't her mother. Said the past was the past. Said she loved him. Couldn't that be enough? Michael said he'd asked about the wedding planning meeting, about the deposits, about why they hadn't been paid. Linda got defensive, said Michael was listening to his mother too much, said I was poisoning him against her. Then Doris got involved, called Michael's phone directly, accused him of being ungrateful, said Linda was a catch, that he should be thanking them for giving him a chance, that plenty of other men would be grateful. That last part, Michael said, was what did it. The mask didn't just slip, it fell completely off. The woman who'd sat in my living room with her pearls and practiced smile. She was gone. In her place was someone cold, someone who saw relationships as transactions, who measured people by their bank accounts. Michael said he'd told Linda it was over, right there on the phone. She'd begged, said they could fix it, said they'd keep her mother out of the planning, but Michael said no, said he couldn't build a life with someone whose foundation was deception. The line went quiet after he told me. I could hear him breathing, steady but shaky, like someone who'd just run a long race. I asked if he was okay. He said he didn't know. He said he'd thought she was the one, thought he'd finally found someone, thought he'd stopped being alone. Now he was back where he started, except older, more tired, more disappointed. I told him he wasn't alone, that he'd never been alone, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from something that looks right but feels wrong. He was quiet. Then he said he was sorry for not listening sooner, for thinking I was just a meddling mother, for not trusting my instincts. I said there was nothing to apologize for. That love makes us blind, that hope makes us stupid, that we all make mistakes. The only real mistake is not learning from them. We talked for another hour about everything, about nothing, the way you do when a crisis passes, when the adrenaline drains away and you're just tired, just grateful, just there. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen as the light faded. The relief was overwhelming, physical. I felt it in my shoulders, in my chest, like I'd been holding my breath for weeks and could finally exhale. The church bell rang. 6 o'clock, Monday evening. I listened to it fade into the November air. This time, it didn't sound like a warning, didn't sound like a curse. It sounded like what it was, just a bell, marking time, calling people home. I made myself dinner, heated up the soup I'd frozen. It tasted better this time, less like obligation, more like comfort. I ate slowly, savored each bite. Small joys, that's what matters in the end. Outside my window, the last leaves were falling, the trees almost bare, winter coming. But I wasn't afraid of winter, not anymore. I'd survived too many seasons, knew that spring always follows, that life continues, that hope renews. Michael was hurt, that was true, but he was free. Free from a relationship built on lies, free from a future that would have slowly poisoned him, free to find something real, something true, and he would. I knew he would, because he was my son, and if there's one thing I'd taught him, it was resilience, the ability to fall down and stand back up, to trust again after being hurt, to remain open after being closed. That's not something you learn from happiness. That's something you learn from surviving, from enduring, from walking through fire and coming out the other side. The mask had shattered. The truth had surfaced. The bell had stopped warning. Now we could begin to heal. I wish I could tell you the story ended there, that Michael walked away and Linda and Doris disappeared quietly into the distance. But that's not how it happened. People like them don't go quietly. 3 days after the breakup, the social media posts started. Carol showed me on her laptop. My hands weren't steady enough to scroll through it myself. Linda had written a long post. She said Michael had broken her heart, that his mother had turned him against her, that our family was cruel and judgmental. Doris posted too. Hers was worse. She called me a bitter old woman, said I couldn't stand to see my son happy, said I'd fabricated evidence, lied about their charitable work. She threatened legal action for defamation. The posts got shared. Comments piled up. People who didn't know us, didn't know the truth. They called me terrible names, said I was toxic, controlling, that I'd ruined my son's chance at love. I sat in Carol's kitchen reading those words. Each one felt like a slap. My hands shook. My throat felt tight. I asked Carol what we should do. She said we fight back, but carefully, legally, with truth. She drafted a letter through her old law firm. It laid out the facts, the church records, the unpaid bills, Susan's testimony, the settlement documents. It didn't attack Linda or Doris personally. It just stated what was documented, what was provable, what was real. The letter went to their lawyer. It said if they didn't retract the posts and issue a public apology, we'd file suit for harassment, for defamation, for intentional infliction of emotional distress. It took 4 days. Then the posts came down, all of them, deleted. A new post appeared on Linda's page, brief, professional. It said there had been a misunderstanding, that both parties wished each other well, that they requested privacy during this difficult time. No real apology, but silence. And sometimes, silence is enough. Michael came over the day the posts disappeared. He looked lighter somehow, like he'd been carrying something heavy and finally set it down. He thanked Carol, said he didn't know what we would have done without her. She waved it off, said that's what friends do, what community means. The weeks that followed were quiet. November turned to December. The town decorated for Christmas. Lights on Main Street, wreaths on doors, the smell of pine and cinnamon everywhere you went. Michael started coming to Sunday dinners again. At first he seemed subdued, wounded, but slowly, week by week, I watched him heal. Watched the light return to his eyes, the ease to his laugh. One Sunday in January, after the holidays had passed, he mentioned the library. He said he'd been going there to work sometimes, said it was quieter than his office, better for concentration. He talked about the librarian. Annie said she was helpful, kind, had recommended some books he'd enjoyed. He said it casually, but there was something in his voice, something soft, hopeful. I asked if she was nice. He smiled, said very nice. Then he changed the subject. But I'd seen that look, known that tone. A mother knows. The next Sunday he mentioned her again, said she'd helped him find research materials for a project, said she knew more about engineering history than he'd expected, said they'd talked for over an hour. I asked if he'd invited her to coffee. He looked surprised, then embarrassed, said he hadn't thought about it. I raised my eyebrows. He laughed, said, okay, maybe he had thought about it, but he wasn't ready. It was too soon. I told him there's no timeline for healing, that hearts know when they're ready, that sometimes the best things come when you're not looking for them. 2 weeks later, he told me he'd asked Annie to dinner. She'd said yes. They were going to the Italian place on 3rd Street, the one with the red checkered tablecloths and candles and wine bottles. I'd been there with Robert decades ago, back when things were good between us. Michael looked nervous, excited, like a teenager before prom. I helped him pick out a shirt, told him to be himself, to listen more than talk, to ask questions. He hugged me before he left, said he'd call tomorrow, tell me how it went. He called at 9 the next morning. I was still in my bathrobe, coffee in hand. He said it was wonderful, that Annie was genuine, real, no pretense, no games. She loved books and hiking, made terrible puns, laughed at his jokes even when they weren't funny. He said they'd talked until the restaurant closed, walked around town afterward, the winter air crisp and clean, stars bright overhead. He'd walked her to her car. She'd kissed his cheek, act when she could see him again. Over the months that followed, I watched their relationship grow, watched Michael transform, not back to who he was, but into someone new, someone wiser, someone who'd survived pain and come out stronger. Annie started joining us for Sunday dinners. She'd bring fresh bread from the bakery, always asked if she could help in the kitchen, never tried too hard, never performed. She was just herself, easy, comfortable. Like she'd always been part of our family. She told stories about the library patrons, the kids who came for story hour, the elderly gentleman who read every biography they owned. She had this way of seeing people, really seeing them, finding what made them special. I watched her with Michael, the way she touched his arm when he talked, the way she listened with her whole attention, the way she made him laugh, real laughter, the kind that comes from joy, not politeness. One Sunday in May, we sat together on my garden bench, Michael and Annie, my 2 grandchildren playing in the yard. The lilacs were blooming, their scent sweet and heavy on the air, birds singing, sunlight warm on my face. Michael had his arm around Annie. She leaned into him naturally, like she belonged there. My grandchildren ran over, showed Annie a beetle they'd found. She examined it with genuine interest, told them what kind it was. They beamed at her. I sat watching them all. This makeshift family, this collection of people who'd found each other, sometimes through pain, sometimes through chance, but always through truth. The church bell rang in the distance, 4 o'clock, Sunday afternoon. I listened to it fade, remembered that Sunday almost a year ago when it had sounded like warning, like prophecy, like doom. I'd been right to listen, right to trust my instincts, right to fight for my son even when he fought against me, but I'd also been lucky. Lucky that Michael had eyes to see, a heart willing to recognize truth, courage to walk away from something that looked right but wasn't. Annie asked what I was thinking about. She had this gentle way of checking in, making sure people felt included. I told her I was thinking about bells, about warnings, about how sometimes the worst things lead to the best things. She nodded like she understood. Maybe she did. She worked with books, with stories. She knew how narratives work, how conflict leads to resolution, how pain leads to growth, how loss leads to finding. Michael squeezed her shoulder, asked if I was getting philosophical in my old age. I laughed, told him I'd always been philosophical. He just hadn't been paying attention. We sat there together as the afternoon stretched into evening, as the light turned golden, as the shadows grew long. My grandchildren's laughter mixed with birdsong, the smell of lilacs mixing with fresh-cut grass, Annie's hand in Michael's, his smile genuine and free. This was happiness, not the dramatic kind, not the kind with fireworks and grand gestures, but the quiet kind, the real kind, the kind built on truth and trust, the kind that lasts. I thought about Linda and Doris sometimes, wondered where they were, what they were doing, who they were deceiving now. But I didn't dwell on it. Some people never change, never learn, never stop performing. That's their tragedy, their loss, not mine, not Michael's, not anymore. The bell rang again. 5 o'clock. Time for dinner. Annie helped me up from the bench. Her hand was strong, steady. We walked toward the house together. Michael gathered the children. Their voices filled the air, filled my heart. That bell all those months ago, it hadn't been ringing a curse. It had been ringing an invitation, calling us toward something better, something truer, something worth the pain of getting there. I'd learned that lesson once before, with Robert, with loss, with starting over, and I'd learned it again, with Michael, with Linda, with protection and release. The lesson is simple. Truth always surfaces, always finds its way to light. You can cover it, delay it, deny it, but you can't stop it. Not forever, not really. And when truth finally breaks through, when the masks finally shatter, when the bells finally stop warning, something beautiful can grow, something real, something worth the fight. We gathered around my kitchen table, the same table where so much had happened, where I'd confronted Michael, where I'd laid out evidence, where we'd both cried and fought and finally understood each other. Now it was filled with food and family, with laughter and love, with Annie asking for my soup recipe, with Michael teasing his children, with all of us together, real, present, free. This is what I want you to understand, what I drove all this way to tell you. When you see danger coming for someone you love, you speak up, even when they don't want to hear it, even when it costs you, even when you stand alone, because truth matters. Trust matters. Protecting the people you love matters more than being liked, more than being thanked, more than being understood in the moment. You do it because it's right, because you've lived long enough to recognize patterns, because your scars have taught you wisdom, because love sometimes means standing firm when everything else says to yield. And if you're lucky, very lucky, they'll eventually see what you saw. They'll understand what you knew. They'll come back to your kitchen table, not just forgiven, but grateful, but whole. That's my story. That's my truth. The bell that warned, the son who listened, the masks that shattered, the happiness that came after. Thank you for letting me share it with you today.